Well, good evening. We are continuing our series on heroes and villains. And in week 1, we studied the hero Deborah. And we asked the question, am I committed to God's glory in the roles or the role that he has given me? If you remember Deborah, God gave her some very significant roles of wisdom and leadership, public ministry that was challenging, and she committed herself to it and led admirably. An amazing judge and prophet. Well, last week, week number 2, we looked at Jonathan's armor bearer, and we asked the question, who am I following? Who am I looking to for leadership right now? Are they pursuing God? Am I putting myself in the place of God's blessing? Jonathan's armor bearer, he followed a leader in such a way that he put himself in the place of God's blessing. And God poured out his blessing on him. We don't even know this man's name. And yet he was making wise choices and was a great example for us. Well, the story that we have tonight takes place a little bit after the Jonathan's armor bearer story. All right, so Saul is still king. Last week we looked at 1 Samuel chapter 14. In moving down through the story a little bit farther, Saul is still king, but David has now been anointed king. Okay, so in 1 Samuel chapter 16, David is anointed king, and then in 1 Samuel 17, David kills Goliath. So this is the setting. We know some of these stories, right? Where Samuel goes and all the brothers are in a line and little David's number 7, right? And he gets anointed king. Well, David then goes and kills Goliath. And then there's this time, in chapters 18 to 24, there's this season where Saul has David come to his palace, and David is a harpist. And Saul is in a bad mood, but David will play the harp, and Saul will calm down. And then Saul will lose his mind and try to spear David to the wall. And we can actually watch Saul kind of go insane, if you will. It's just this amazing time. But even up to chapter 24, that's the amazing story where, and this is in the Bible, Saul goes into a cave to relieve himself, and David has the opportunity to kill Saul, but he doesn't. He just cuts the corner of his robe. You preached on this just a few weeks ago. All right, and so that's in 1 Samuel chapter 24. And all this time that Saul is vacillating back and forth on where he stands with David, Jonathan is loyal. He's a loyal friend to David. Well, at the beginning of chapter 25 in 1 Samuel, Samuel dies. And we learn of this beloved prophet, this beloved judge. He passes on. David, the 1 Samuel 25:1 tells us, David moved to the far south of Israel. And he actually, he and his men are hiding in this area now from Saul. Saul is trying to kill David. David's been anointed king. He's not on the throne yet, and he's fleeing from Saul. So I don't know if you can really see this map, but you can see the Dead Sea. Is there a pointer? Yeah, there is. Okay. You see the Dead Sea. It doesn't really work on our cool screen. Sorry. You can see it on the ceiling. All right. Anyway, up near the top there, we got to work on that, Josh. You see the Dead Sea, and you see the word up there. It says En-Gedi. Those of you that have been to Israel, how many of you have been to En-Gedi? Okay, it is one of my favorite places in the entire country. It's a place where, David's hiding from Saul in the desert, and I'm thinking he's hiding under a sand dune or something. But actually, there's these areas where it is the desert, but there's water, there's springs that then become small rivers, and they become waterfalls as they flow into the Dead Sea, and there's caves in there. And that's that area of En-Gedi, and that's probably up in that area where Saul went into a cave, and David cut the corner of his robe instead of killing Saul. Well, now David has come down south, and you can see this in this area down here, that's the desert of Paran. Okay, and so David and his men are down in this southern region, and that's where our story begins. So I want to invite you to turn to 1 Samuel chapter 25. We're going to begin at verse 2. And if you're using one of our church Bibles, you can find that on page 172. 1 Samuel chapter 25 and verse 2. Let me pray before we read. Father, this story is a challenging story. It's a challenging story for me. You know, as you've been prompting my heart, you've been prompting my mind as I've been rereading your word. And so, Father, I ask that you help us to be willing as a church tonight, as we look at this story and these amazing characters that you've given to us in such rich detail. Father, please help us to approach this humbly. Help us to understand what you are doing through these characters' lives and how they responded to you. And Father, please, as James prayed earlier, help us to understand how we should be responding to you. And be willing to make the changes that you are calling for in our own lives. Father, thank you for the truth of your word and that we get to study it openly together. In your Son's name we come to you. Amen. Well, before I begin reading, I'd like to introduce the story, the characters in the story to you, because this story, it really, if we had swords and time, this would be a great story to actually act out up here. This is an epic movie, if you will. Just in one chapter, the story that unfolds, the characters that are developed in this, it's absolutely amazing. And so what I want to do tonight is I actually want to just read through the chapter and walk through the story step by step. And then at the very end, we'll draw some conclusions. But the story is so rich, we just need to spend time in the chapter together. So before we do that, let me just introduce, I want you to know the three people that we're focusing on. The first one is Nabal. He's a man. He's very, very wealthy, but he's described as someone he's condescending. He's not wealthy in a good way. He's smug. He's surly. He's mean. Okay, so he's just a thoroughly bad character. All right, so but as we're going through the story, see how he's described and see how he interacts with the others. Our second character is a lady. Her name is Abigail, and we're told that she is incredibly wise and she's beautiful. She's the hero. We need to keep our eyes on how she responds to the crisis and what she does in this story, okay? And then we have a third character, another man whose name is David. David is a young, passionate soldier. He's a leader, but his actions in this story, and in one way, they're very hasty and rash, but he also demonstrates that he's teachable. And so I want to invite you to evaluate how the author presents him in this story. Okay, so I tried to find as neutral of a face as I could. So I want you to decide on the third character, okay? Now, as we go into this story, understand, if you understand literature, if you understand classic storytelling, everything is in this story. There's an introduction, preliminary action, and then there's rising action as the character development happens. There's the climax of the moment of, oh no, what's going to happen now? Then there's the falling action, and then there's the resolution and conclusion. We can see all of it just in this one chapter, okay? So let's see what happens as we dive in. Verses 2 and 3. Now, there was a man in Maon whose business was in Carmel, and the man was very rich. He had 3,000 sheep and 1,000 goats, and he was shearing his sheep in Carmel. The name of the man was Nabal, and the name of his wife Abigail, and she was a woman of good understanding and beautiful appearance. But the man was harsh and evil in his doings. He was of the house of Caleb. Okay, so did anyone read ahead, a little quiz time, anyone read ahead and look up what Nabal's name means? Anyone know? Sue? Did it slip? Okay. Anyone know it? Go ahead. Fool. All right, so his name means fool. Now, please understand, it is probably, okay, when you learn that, you go, are you kidding me? What mom would name their kid fool? What do you think he's going to turn out like? Okay, in all honesty, it's most likely his mom did not name him fool, okay? This is the author saying, hey, this guy's a fool. Or it's possible that's what his friends called him behind his back. I don't know if you have a nickname that you don't know about or that you wish you didn't know about, but that's kind of the setting here, okay? His name is Nabal. He's a fool, and he's going to play the role in this, okay? Abigail, his wife, is intelligent and beautiful, and then we're told at the end of verse 3, he was of the house of Caleb. That means his ancestor was Caleb, of Caleb and Joshua fame. This is going to become significant later in the story. Basically, the author is saying, hey, this guy is from famous blood here. Okay, this is kind of like saying he's from, he's a Rockefeller, if you will. Or, oh yeah, he's from George Washington's family. Okay, this guy is amazing. Okay, he's from he has a famous ancestor. All right, so when David heard, verse 4, when David heard in the wilderness that Nabal was shearing his sheep, David sent 10 young men. And David said to the young men, go up to Carmel, go to Nabal, and greet him in my name. And thus you shall say to him, who lives in prosperity, peace be to you, peace to your house, and peace to all that you have. Now I have heard that you have shearers. Your shepherds were with us, and we did not hurt them, nor was there anything missing from them all the while they were in Carmel. Ask your young men, and they will tell you. Therefore, let my young men find favor in your eyes, for we come on a feast day. Please give whatever comes to your hand and your servants, and to your son David. So, when David's young men came, they spoke to Nabal according to all these words in the name of David and waited. I don't know if you heard all the number of times the word David and the name of David were in those few verses. But here's what's going on. When I first read this, I went, okay, why is David sending 10 guys to ask this guy for money? Well, who does David think he is? He's running around down in the desert, and this guy's shearing sheep, so he's like, oh, he's making money. Let's go see if he'll give us some. Okay, that was my initial inclination when I read it. I'm like, wow, what is David thinking he's doing? So I looked it up. Okay, why does David doing this? And what I learned was this is absolutely culturally appropriate. What was happening is let me back up just a couple slides. A bunch of slides. What's going on is they're down in this big region down here in the south. This is a lawless area. It's far away from any big cities. So what's going on is David is down here with his soldiers. He has 600 soldiers at this point. And they become a patrol, if you will, of the area. And so anyone that has herds down there, herdsmen, David's men, they're protecting them from robbers, from thieves who would come in and steal their animals, or from other wild animals who would come in and kill their animals. And so they've been a protection to them. And this was commonplace at that time. And so what David is doing now is those men that are running around in the desert, they're not protecting these herdsmen. They're not getting paid. The payment comes at the time of the shearing. A similar analogy today could be if you buy a house with a realtor, the realtor gets a commission because they provided a service to you, they helped you sell the house, and so in the end, you all understand, they get paid. If we go out to a restaurant and the server does a great job, we want to reward them with a really big tip for services rendered. They treated us respectfully, the food was amazing. Even if the service isn't good, we know we give them a tip because that's the right thing to do, right? And so that's exactly what's happening here. David, by the way, just on that note, it's been very interesting recently. We'll come back to this later on, but even right now, I understand that in America, 20% tip is the standard. I think that's what our culture or our custom is. There are folks that have lost money. Restaurants have fewer patrons, and this is a great moment to be a great witness and tip more if we can. We'll get back to that later on, but I was just with someone today, and we had lunch, and I think it was $17, and they went, oh no, $17, that's only $3.50 in tip. I can't leave just $3.50 for somebody, and they marked it up higher. And I went, that's a godly guy right there, all right? So David approaches Nabal and says, listen, can you help us out? We've been protecting your sheep. Can we get our tip now? Which was appropriate. Interestingly enough, David's approach to him, if you see those words, he's saying, peace to you. If you have anything extra, go ahead and send it. Can you imagine the electric company sending you a bill? Peace be on you. We're glad that you've been cool during the summer. If you have any change in your drawer, would you just drop it in an envelope and send it? No, that's not what's happening. But this is the tenor that David's saying. David's saying, hey, if you have anything extra, it'd be great if you wouldn't mind sending it with my 10 young men. Well, let's see what happens. The momentum is now going to start to rise pretty quickly. Verse 10. Then Nabal answered David's servants and said, who is David? And who is the son of Jesse? There are many servants nowadays who break away, each one from his master. Shall I then take my bread and my water and my meat that I have killed for my shears and give it to men when I do not know where they are from? So David's young men turned on their heels and went back. And they came and told David all these words. It's interesting that David's men did not respond to Nabal. They didn't say, are you sure you don't know who David is? Have you heard of Goliath? David kind of kills people. They didn't say anything. They turned around and they went back. All right? And what Nabal is saying here is, if you see his words, he's saying, who's David? He knows who David is. There's no doubt he knows who David is, and that's going to become abundantly clear in just a few moments. David is saying, hey, I'm a Calebite. You're nothing. I'm not giving you anything. I earned all this money. You don't deserve it. He's being a tightwad. He's being a cheapskate. He's also being short-sighted. He is insulting what I would argue, the person I would argue is the most dangerous warrior within 100 miles. And David isn't alone. Do we know who's with David? Have we heard of David's mighty men? David's got guys with him that they've killed hundreds of soldiers on their own. David has an army of 600 people, and Nabal's like, I'm not giving you anything. All right, so we have some issues here. Well, what happens? Okay, can you see the momentum now that the story's going? Okay, we've got some conflict rising. What's going to happen next? All right. Supposed to be way ahead. Okay, we're at verse 13. Then David said to his men, so as David's 10 men come back to him, then David said to his men, every man gird on his sword. So every man girded on his sword. And David also girded on his sword. And about 400 men went with David, and 200 stayed with the supplies. Okay. Notice what David does not do here. David's 10 men come back and say, well, here's what Nabal said. David did not say, you know what, guys? His name's Nabal. We should have expected him to be a fool. Let's sleep on it tonight. Let's pray. Let's get some sleep. Let's rest on it. Let's think about it. Let's have a little conference tomorrow with the smartest guys in the group, and we'll make a decision tomorrow how we're going to. David doesn't do that, does he? The guys come back, and he's impulsive. He goes, everybody grab your sword. We're going. It was rash. It was hasty. He took off. Okay, well, what happens then? Verse 14. Now, one of the young men told Abigail, Nabal's wife, saying, look, David sent messengers from the wilderness to greet our master, and he reviled them. This word is, he insulted them. It can even mean he screamed at them. All right? But the men were very good to us. Now, in verse 15, we're actually getting the background. We're actually getting the setting that these guys, David's men, really did protect Nabal's herds. They were awesome. Look at this, verse 15. But the men were very good to us, and we were not hurt, nor did we miss anything as long as we accompanied them when we were in the fields. They were a wall to us, both by night and day, all the time we were with them, keeping the sheep. So the servant is saying, look, they were amazing. They completely protected us. They were a huge help. So verse 17, now, therefore, know and consider what you will do. This is amazing. The servant could have gone to Nabal and said, do you realize how helpful these guys were? Will you reconsider? The servant doesn't. The servant goes to Abigail, and the servant actually says to Abigail, what do you want to do? What's your solution? He says to her, now therefore, know and consider what you will do. For harm is determined against our master and against all his household. For he is such a scoundrel that one cannot speak to him. Now that verse is amazing to me, that a servant would be that disrespectful to a master speaking to the master's wife. So they're pretty bold. Nabal is at an entirely new level of being so out of touch. He's a mess that his servants are even saying, we can't even talk to this guy. But the servant goes to Abigail and says, what's your plan? What's your solution here? The servant trusts Abigail to come up with a solution. Well, let's see what Abigail does. Verses 18 to 19. Then Abigail made haste and took 200 loaves of bread. Who has 200 loaves of bread? There's so many aspects of this story. You go, okay, so she takes 200 loaves of bread, 2 skins of wine, 5 sheep already dressed, 5 seahs of roasted grain, 100 clusters of raisins, and 200 cakes of figs, and loaded them on donkeys. All right, we heard in the very beginning that Nabal was wealthy. Obviously, Nabal is wealthy. This is an extraordinary amount of food. She gathers it all up. And she says to her servants, go on before me, see I am coming after you. But she did not tell her husband, Nabal. A couple things that are significant here. David responded right away, didn't he? But his response was impulsive. It was rash. Abigail responded right away as well. But her response was wise. She had a plan, and she knew what she was going to do, and her response was reasoned. There's a contrast between the two of them. She did not try to reason with her husband, but she chose to go directly into the path of an oncoming army intent on destroying her entire family. So the courage that she exhibits here is incredible. We have no indication that she's ever talked to David before. She doesn't know if he says, thank you very much, and you're all dead. She does not know what's going to happen. But she heads towards David with enough food to feed an army. Okay, well, what happens? Well, in verses 20 to 22, we have this little stretch where David's kind of nursing his own wounds, saying, I cannot believe Nabal treated me that way. I'm going to kill him. So let's jump down to verse 23. Verse 23, now when Abigail saw David, she dismounted quickly from the donkey, fell on her face before David, and bowed down to the ground. Now, if I tried to teach this lesson today in a high school, there'd be a lot of women really mad, okay? But stay with me in the way that Abigail is approaching David. Listen to all these descriptive words. We're at the moment here, what's going to happen. She saw David, she dismounted from the donkey, fell on her face before David, bowed down to the ground. She fell at his feet and said, on me, my Lord, on me, let this iniquity be. And please let your maidservant speak in your ears and hear the words of your maidservant. What Abigail is doing here is she's using a classic persuasive speech. The way that she moves through this, she's in this culture, she is appropriately saying, will you please forgive us? We have wronged. She says, on me, let this iniquity or let this sin be. Was it her fault? No, it had nothing to do with her. And David was completely aware of that. But she's approaching him with complete humility. And she's saying, will you please accept this gift? She's humbling herself before him. Again, I don't understand. This is complete disclosure here. I do not understand her level of wisdom and humility in this situation. She could have just as easily gone to David and said, do you know my husband's name? He's acting the way, I'm so sorry. The guy is an idiot. He's a jerk. He's a fool. Will you please forgive us? This guy, he's such a mess. I can't stand him, but I'm stuck. She didn't say any of that stuff. She said, it's me. She honored her miserable husband. Amazing. Absolutely amazing. But it gets better. Look at verse 28. See what she says in 28. She says, please forgive the trespass of your maidservant, for the Lord will certainly make from my Lord, that's David, make from my Lord an enduring house. Because my Lord, again, that's David, because David fights the battles of the Lord, and evil is not found in you throughout your days. Look down at verse 30. And it shall come to pass, when the Lord has done for my Lord, according to all the good that he has spoken concerning you, and has appointed you ruler over Israel. Abigail, in humility, is going to David and saying, please put the guilt on me. Please forgive us. David, you have been guiltless in your young leadership so far. You've been fighting the battles that God has wanted you to fight. And God's going to establish your family. He's going to establish your lineage because of that. And she says, David, you're going to be the king. Don't do this right now and put innocent blood on your hands. This woman is rebuking an angry general. She has a guy with a sword and 399 other guys with swords behind him, and she's actually rebuking him in an amazingly gracious and humble way. I'm telling you, this woman is amazing in how she approaches this situation. She is the exact opposite of Nabal. Nabal he was approached graciously. David didn't send 400 soldiers to Nabal. David sent 10. 10 young men. Said, would you be willing to give us a little something? Nabal yells at them, disrespects them. David brings 400 men, and Abigail is humble and gracious. The contrast couldn't be wider. But interestingly enough, I think she's also contrasted with David in this. Because she's responding with humility and grace, David got angry and wanted to kill the whole family. So there's a contrast happening. Okay, well, what actually happens? All right, verses 35 to 44, David responds to her. Look at verse 35, or verse 34. No, back up, sorry, verse 32. Then David said to Abigail, blessed is the Lord God of Israel, who sent you this day to meet me, and blessed is your advice, and blessed are you, because you have kept me this day from coming to bloodshed and from avenging myself with my own hand. Men, I don't know how David was able to turn so fast. Most of us, when we've already made a fool out of ourselves and someone calls us on it, it is very hard to backtrack. David is teachable here. David sees Abigail, he hears her words and realizes she's speaking the truth. And he says, blessed be God, blessed be you from saving me from doing this. And he goes on to say, thank you. He takes the offering that she brought, and as we go through the rest of the story, he turned around and went home. He didn't kill anybody that day. So, do you know the rest of the story? Abigail goes back. She's going to tell Nabal, but he's drunk. I mean, he's smashed. So she waits. The next day, he's sober. He wakes up. She tells him what happened. He has a heart attack. 10 days later, God kills him. He's done. That was it. It's the end of Nabal. David finds out that Abigail is now a widow. And so you could look at it nobly and say, widows in those days were vulnerable. And so David proposes marriage to her. In some ways, this makes sense. She is brilliant. She is someone who would be worthy of being the wife of a king. She could help him make wise decisions. She's obviously has maturity that he doesn't have at this point. Unfortunately, it's not that awesome and rosy, because the author actually tells us in verses 43 and 44, there's some foreshadowing there. It says, David's adding Abigail to a harem. He's a polygamist, and there's a foreshadowing that future trouble is coming, okay? So, what is the takeaway? What's a lesson? Well, I want to just touch on two very, very quickly. First of all, guys, is your wife in a miserable marriage? Are you being a jerk? Are you being stubborn? Are you humble enough that you would be willing tonight to go to your wife and say, babe, am I making your life miserable? And if I am, would you tell me? Would you do that, guys? because we get stubborn. And Abigail's amazing. She stayed faithful to him to the end. You know what? She could have said nothing. She could have said, oh, it's September. Let me go to the Dead Sea and have a float day for a couple of days and let David wipe out my jerk of a husband, and then I'll come back. She didn't, did she? She tried to save him. Amazing. Are you a David? Have you been confronted with something in the last day and your response was anger? Well, I'll show them. They're not going to disrespect me. Okay, what about Abigail, our heroine tonight? The first one is this. I touched on it earlier. Generosity matters. Nabal was stingy, and it killed him. Abigail was generous, and we really should be too. My question is for us this evening, this is a tough time for some people. Who is God laying on your heart right now that you could be generous with them? God gives us resources, and he intends for us to steward them for his glory. Can you be generous with someone? Last question. Timing matters. Abigail responded immediately, but in wisdom. I don't know if you had this rule in your house. Your parents may have had it. You may have had it. First time obedience. The phrase that in my mind is delayed obedience is disobedience. Abigail obeyed immediately, and it saved her family, except for Nabal. Is God calling you to obey, and you've been pushing it back? Is God saying, Pastor Brock on Sunday challenged us? If we're worrying, that's a sign of pride that we're trying to fix something on our own, and we need to grow in humility. Is God working on you, and you're wanting to push that back? Abigail responded immediately, and she was humble and gracious, and God used her powerfully. Amazing. What an amazing example. Next week, we're going to look at the prophet Nathan. So if you want to look at 2 Samuel chapter 12 and read that before next Wednesday night, I'm looking forward to sharing with you, and we'll dive into that study together. Okay, let me pray. Heavenly Father, I've already confessed Abigail has a maturity level and wisdom that I don't have, but I would like to. So will you please help me grow? And would you grow each of us? We don't want more knowledge. We do want to know you better, but we don't want it to stop there. We don't want more knowledge without application. Please help us grow in wisdom like Abigail, that we'll know you more, we'll know your word more, but we'll also be applying it. Please help us to grow in our courage. Help us to grow in our grace. Please help us to grow in our humility. In your Son's name we come to you. Amen.